Today's video does contain some subject matter that some people may find disturbing, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you'd like to hear on the channel, please go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to send it my way. And of course, as always, thank you. I've been a trucker for about 20 years now, doing both local runs as well as long hauls. I listen to a lot of podcasts covering similar topics like yours, and thanks to my wife, she introduced me to your channel and she convinced me to send in a story that happened to us a while back. We work well together, and there's never a dull moment between us. This was something we experienced on one of our trips. I was getting pretty close to my 11th hour driving, and my wife wanted to sleep in our cab instead of a motel. I had made some upgrades to the cab and added some simple amenities, so it was pretty comfortable. We were on a pretty flat and open area of the highway, so we stopped on the side and set out my cones for safety. One thing I did have in my cab was a refrigerator, as well as a small portable grill, so we would often bring along our own food to make. We pulled out some hamburger patties in the grill and started making a late dinner for us. The night was actually quite peaceful, and the only light on us was from our flashlight, or my clip-on light that I used when under the hood. We could hear the sounds of crickets chirping and the smell of petrichor coming from the nearby vegetation. There was a massive storm the night before after what locals told me was a pretty long drought for them. As we indulged in our meals, we talked and relaxed in our chairs, staring into the trees and taking in the simple joys of existence. When our conversation started getting shorter and shorter, we knew that it was about time to pack up and head to bed. That was around the time that something started to feel unusual. I was trying to figure out what it was when my wife said, "Do you hear that?" I remained quiet to see if I could discern what she meant, but I didn't hear anything. But that was her point. Unlike how it was just a few minutes ago, it was completely silent. There wasn't a single cricket chirping, no sound from the slight breeze and trees swaying, not even a low hum coming from our light. All I could hear was our talking and my breaths. We both agreed that it was an odd occurrence and chalked it up to maybe another storm coming, and mentally we both understood that we should hurry up and get back in the cab. As my wife was getting ready for bed, I was at the front in the driver's seat putting my wallet in the glove box. There was something in the distance that kind of caught my eye. It was a light. There was nothing but darkness surrounding us just prior, other than the one car that had passed by. As mentioned, we were on a pretty flat stretch of highway, but I could clearly see a light just peeking up from the distance in front of us. As we were on the road, I told myself that it was just an oncoming car, turned off the cab light, and walked towards the back. From the time it took me to walk back to the bed and sit on it, that car should have passed us. But I never heard the sound, so I asked my wife if she heard or saw anything, and she declined. This had my interest piqued, so I stood back up to look out the front window, and there it was. The light was still sitting there, like I had seen earlier. This time, I was telling my wife what I was seeing, which caused her to join me. We both stared at this light, trying to determine what it could be, and thought maybe it was another vehicle that was stopped on the side of the road too. We thought about it for a moment. My wife, being the altruistic person she was, wanted to see if maybe they needed help, whereas I've heard and seen way too many stories of similar situations, and told her that we were not going out there. She suggested that we could just drive up to it, but that would involve me having to get out, get my cones, and really, to be honest, I was tired, and being way too lazy to do that. So I told her that we should just leave it alone, and if they were still there in the morning, we could check it out. She reluctantly agreed, and we both went to bed, but I still couldn't shake this thought that there was something more to that light. After my wife had drifted off, I still laid there awake, wondering what it could be, so I ended up getting up to look again. It was still there, but this time, it was different. Prior, it was the normal color that I would expect for headlights. This was now a deep yellow color. The odds of it being another car in the exact same spot, right out of view with different colored headlights, just seemed very unlikely. Something told me that I needed to do something, to have a record of this. So I went to grab my phone and get a picture or video of it. As I quietly returned and opened the camera, I watched the light shift slightly and change from yellow to red. This caused me to freeze and just watch. That's when I felt the vibration in the floor beneath my feet. I looked back at the light and watched as it grew wider and taller, until I was hit with the bright neon red light. I couldn't look directly at it, it was so bright. But as it rose up, I could see a metal shape of some kind of vehicle, but I couldn't make out what it was. And as I was trying to shield my eyes from the light, it slowly grew darker, until I was able to look again. That's when I noticed the road was now shrouded in that red light. It was almost as if the source of the light was now directly above us, but the light was still so intense. Not only was it bright, but you could almost feel the heat coming from it. What the hell could possibly cause something like that? Lastly, in nearly an instant, I saw the light flash back to the deep yellow that I had seen, and the rumbling had stopped. I didn't understand how my wife hadn't woken up to this. It was almost like an airplane was flying very low to the ground. It was that kind of rumbling. With the light now directly above us, my curiosity got the best of me, and I opened my driver's side door to try and look for the source of the light. I looked straight up, and could make out what looked to be a dark triangle hovering above us. The light was definitely coming from this thing, and I felt as though I had just outed myself. I quickly shut the door, and I went back to bed praying that what I saw wasn't real and that I was just dreaming. I was hoping that my prayers were answered when I was awoken by my wife. But something was wrong. She sounded startled, and I was on the floor, not the bed. When I finally came to and had my bearings, I assured her that I was fine and asked what had happened. She said that she woke up to an intense high-pitched ringing sound, and when she looked over at me, she saw me sitting on the floor. She was terrified, but by the time I came to, the sound was gone and I never heard it. In fact, even with the rumbling in the ground, it was still silent, all the way through. But one of the many parts of this that was bizarre was that I remember walking back to the bed again and getting in it. Yet, I was on the floor. We climbed back into bed, and I told her everything I had seen, and she did the same, even though she was asleep through most of it. We both got up and looked outside, but it was now completely dark. There were no yellow or red lights anywhere. The road was empty, and we could even hear the wind and crickets again. Then we checked the time and realized that it had only been about 2 hours. I believe that I laid in bed for about half an hour before I got up, so all of that happened, and then I guess I passed out for about an hour to an hour and a half. After convincing my wife that I felt fine, I thought that it was best to just try to get some sleep. I felt exhausted. When we awoke the next morning, I slowly drove in the direction of the light, and there was nothing there. The road was fine, The grass on the side wasn't even flattened like something had been there. We talked about it a bit more as we drove, and we both agreed that it was possibly some kind of military aircraft, I guess. We didn't talk about it for the rest of our trip. In fact, we made sure that we were both in bed, and we only stayed at rest stops and never on the side of the road, secluded from others. It wasn't until we were back home in the privacy of our own house that we finally said out loud what we thought. With the lights and the way that it hovered without any sound, that was no aircraft that we were familiar with. But we were both still pretty terrified to think about what it could have been. Not to mention what could have possibly happened to me since I didn't actually make it to the bed. And honestly, I think I would rather stick to encountering weird people than something that I can't see or arm myself against. I have a story that I have never shared online, mostly because it just never really felt like something I should share, but you convinced me that I should go ahead and get it out there. So, here you go. This is probably the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me, and it happened on what was a fairly normal day otherwise. It happened about 5 years ago, in the middle of the summer. Back when this happened, I was attending evening classes to get an associate's degree, and after class, I went to work. I worked as a box truck driver for a company that produced car parts. Mostly just the plastic ones, though. It may sound strange to some, but the biggest part that we produced, and what was probably our biggest moneymaker, were bumpers. For what they are, they're ridiculously expensive, and they break pretty easily. Anyways, my job amounted to nothing more than overnight parts delivery guy. I got to drive this box truck filled with parts to each of our partner dealerships in town, and I would unload the parts for them. It was a pretty lonely job. It was an overnight job, so no one was ever at the dealership, so it was just me, my truck, and whatever audiobook I was listening to at the time. It was, for lack of a better word, fairly mundane. On the night that this happened, I actually remember that I was listening to the audiobook version of Ready Player One because the movie had just come out in theaters and I wanted to hear the book before I went to go see the movie. I was just driving along, plotting out my route and glancing at the delivery log to see which locations I needed to go to that night, when, out of nowhere, this car came blowing past me on the small 2-lane each-direction highway. It didn't surprise me. People hate being behind trucks. I just didn't really expect to see anyone else on the road this late. They gunned past me on the left, the headlights glaring in my side mirrors, and before I could even react or really process the car, they cut sharply in front of me. I swerved hard, narrowly avoiding a disastrous collision. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweaty on the wheel as I veered over to the shoulder of the road. Interestingly enough, the other car also pulled over just in front of me. Part of me assumed that maybe they wanted to apologize, or maybe they were freaked out, or maybe they were about to go off on me in a bit of road rage, but nothing happened. I sat there in my truck trying to catch my breath, and they just sat there a bit ahead of me, not moving or really doing anything. After about 4 minutes, 2 of the car's doors burst open, and 2 figures jumped out. I assumed that they were going through the motions of the previously mentioned road rage, but then I noticed that they were wearing ski masks. I barely had time to process this before I saw them sprinting towards my truck, guns in hand. I was struck with this paralyzing fear. I really only had 2 options: floor it and risk getting shot, or do whatever the hell they demanded. I was a delivery driver, not a hero, so I decided that it would be less risky to just comply. I put my hands up and I climbed out of the truck, my hands shaking and my breath ragged. The masked men did not waste any time. They nudged me out of the way and two of them jumped into my box truck and then sped off. The third person that hadn't left the car then gunned off down the road, following the truck, leaving behind nothing more than the screeching of their tires. Then there was me, just standing alone on the side of the highway, watching the taillights of both vehicles as they disappeared into the distance, and thinking about whether or not I was going to get reprimanded for this. As I thought about that, and about work, my mind stepped over to, who do I even contact about this? I then realized that I still had my cell phone in my pocket. I pulled it out and dialed 911 and tried to explain everything that had just happened. I must have sounded insane because I remember the operator asking me to calm down, telling me to breathe, and then asking the same question a few times to clarify what I had said. She stayed on the phone with me while I stood there in the same spot the robbers had left me, just waiting for the police. Within a few minutes, I could hear the sirens coming my way, and thankfully they saw me just standing there and realized that I was the one calling. They took my statement and information, and one of them offered me a ride back to the warehouse while the other officers mentioned that they would drive up ahead to see if they could find the truck. Worse yet, they did find it. But it was not the outcome that I had hoped for. They found the truck only about 15 miles up the road, abandoned off the side of the highway, and set ablaze. The truck, the parts in the back, and everything inside the truck was completely destroyed. The metal frame was completely warped from the intense heat of the fire. To this day, I have no idea why this happened. Why me? Why did they take my truck? I can only imagine they did this for the haul, but the truck was very clearly marked as an auto parts delivery truck, and I can't think of any modern parts that would net that much cash that would be in a truck like that. I guess maybe catalytic converters, but I can tell you that my list had 0 of those. So if that's what they were going for, then I was a poorly chosen target. Beyond that, it just felt so damn random and pointless. Either way, it was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I struggled to get back into the cab of another box truck without thinking about that visual of them running at me with shotguns pointing up at me. The fear, the confusion, that mental feeling that I might actually die for some bumpers. I was just a dude driving a truck and doing my job, and it was painful to be pushed so suddenly into this nightmare. I do still work for the company, and I did move up when I got my degree, but I now work in warehouse, and the only thing that I drive for them is the occasional forklift. I used to be a trucker back in the early 2000s until somewhere around 2014, and I loved it. I was never the type to stay in one place for too long. I feel that I also tend to hit completely opposite ends of the spectrum. While my job was in a male-dominated field, and I knew how to work and fix my own rig, I also liked to pamper myself. It wasn't uncommon to see me with my hair, nails, and makeup done while I was behind the wheel. Don't worry, never while driving. It definitely surprised a few people when I explained that I was the driver that pulled in. Some people tend to have a very stereotypical portrayal of what a trucker looks like, so I understand that I didn't fit the bill. Sometimes, I would even be hit on, but I was used to it. One thing I hated, however, was the demeaning comments. The ones where people try to gatekeep who could be a trucker, which is where this story comes from. This was one of the longest hauls that I had been on, as it stretched across 4 states. I saw a lot of cool places and met some very sweet people. I was just about to hit Georgia and I wanted to stop somewhere local to grab something to eat. I ended up finding a cute little diner that was off the highway, with signs saying that they were trucker friendly, usually meaning that they had accommodating parking for them, and they did. I pulled in, got a much needed stretch, and then headed in. I ordered what was probably the best country fried steak and enjoyed my time. My server even stopped for a while and talked with me about my travels, but after a bit, I started to notice this guy that was sitting at a booth a few down from me. I guess I walked by him when I entered, but I didn't pay him much attention. It became a bit more obvious that he was there because he was facing away from me and kept turning around to look at me. At one point, I was trying to be friendly, but also acknowledge that I knew he was looking at me, so I held my coffee cup up in a cheers-like manner. He nodded and then turned back around. It was when I was nearing the end of my meal that this guy walked over to my table. He then asked me where my old man was, and I told him I didn't have one. Again, I got similar questions like this as people didn't think I was the driver, so I always replied honestly. I'm also not easily intimidated. He looked surprised and then started asking me how long I had been doing this, and again I stayed polite throughout the conversation, even when his questions started to seem more like a test. That's when he dropped the old, "You're pretty young to be out here by yourself," and made other comments like, "Why wouldn't you want to be home making a family?" Now, my parents can attest to this, but I have a bit of a mouth on me. Always have. And the comebacks just kind of roll out before I get the chance to stop them. So, I said something along the lines of not wanting to be tied down to an apron. He didn't seem to care for the comment, and replied with something along the lines of how young women shouldn't be in this field. I was done amusing this guy, so I stood up and walked over to the counter where the register was, and I paid for my meal. As I was putting my wallet away, the guy walked over and was rambling on about how women try to push themselves into every field, and then complain about the work and some other lovely comments like that. I again smarted off with something about how he complained more in the 10 minutes we talked than I had ever heard a female trucker complaining in my lifetime. I guess that he didn't like that one, because he shut his mouth with nothing more to say than a chuckle. I thanked the waitress and I walked out. I was pulling something out of the back of my cabin when I heard the guy shout out to me. I was about to leave, so I decided to give him one more chance to just not be that guy from the diner, but I don't know which one was worse. He then asked me if I wanted him to take care of me, and then offered to take me home with him. I more or less told him to go fly a kite, and then got in my truck laughing. He stood there off to the side of where I was parked until I was on the road, and he was out of my view. I chalked it up to another story to tell my friends and family and moved it to the back of my mind. At this point, I'm back on the road and just moving along like normal, when I had a truck come up behind me. You're constantly looking at your surroundings when on the road, because you're behind the wheel of a potential death machine, so I took note of this in case he passed me. As expected, the truck got closer and closer until it got over. I slowed down a bit to give it more time to pass, but then noticed that it was keeping speed next to me. So I looked over at the driver and, wouldn't you know it, it's the guy from the diner. I gave him a look like, "What do you want?" and he made a kissing face at me and then slowed down to get back behind me. I was curious more than anything that this guy just happened to be going the same direction as me, and that he was able to catch up. I had to have a good head start on him, which told me that he was going a lot faster than he probably should have been. That was the first dangerous action that I noted. The fact that he came up next to me and then slowed back down to get behind me made me think that he was just trying to intimidate me. But this was also pretty dangerous, especially if there was a vehicle behind or in front of us. We were on a 2-lane road with passing spots, so he could have easily hit somebody. I didn't waste any time, though, and immediately radioed it in to tell them what I was experiencing. They wanted info on the truck, but I unfortunately didn't see anything other than the front of it being a dark blue. They told me to get off at the next exit to see if he keeps going, and to let them know if this escalates. That's exactly what I was wanting to prevent. Instead, I started to slow down, thinking maybe he would at least get in front of me so I could get his information. And it seemed to work. He got over, sped up next to me, but this time he had a bit more of an annoyed look. He continued accelerating until his trailer was almost past me, but not entirely. Notice what I said there? I don't know if this was done on purpose or if he just wasn't paying attention, but when he started getting over in front of me, no turn signal, and then the back of his trailer hit me. I couldn't slow down enough to prevent it, and it caused the front of my truck to move. I know how to handle a truck, so I had it under control pretty quickly, and I slowed down even more so that I could stop on the shoulder. I noticed the truck didn't have any markings on it, so I immediately radioed the license plate number and what just happened, and they said that they would look into it. I went ahead and called 911 as well to report his ass. He really did not need to be on the road. I stayed on the side for a while to give us some space, as this guy actually kept going. Once I finally got back on the road, I reported that it was clear and tried to get back to my drive. However, maybe half an hour in, I see a truck in the distance on the side of the road, and as I pass it, I see the dark blue front. I didn't know what this guy's intentions were, beyond just trying to scare me, but I didn't want to give him the chance again. So the moment I saw the next exit, I took it. I stopped at a gas station nearby and just reported that I was going to stop for a bit after seeing that same truck. I was usually ahead of schedule anyways, but I would have rather been a little behind than deal with this guy and his dangerous actions. I went in to grab a drink and some things for the road, but when I came back out, I saw that same guy pulling in. I just swiftly walked back to my truck, trying to pretend like I didn't even see the guy. As I sat in my truck thinking of my next move, this guy walked up next to my door and shouted at me. I looked over and rolled down my window and waited for him to speak. He made some comment about how that was why we shouldn't be on the road, because we didn't know how to act under pressure. I basically just told him that what he was doing wasn't normal, and that he was just being a creep. His reaction was to open his jacket a little, showing his piece, and said, "Well, maybe I should just shoot out a tire then, while you're driving. See how you react to that." And he laughed. He really laughed. I rolled up my window and called the cops, now having a good reason. He eventually walked away. I think he went into the gas station, then back to his truck, but I just waited there until a cop showed up. The cop was given a description of my truck, so he pulled up next to me, and I got out and explained a bit more of what was going on. He went up to this guy's truck who was sitting in it at that point, and asked him to step out. I got back in mine, but rolled my windows down to hear what happened. The officer asked him to step out of his vehicle, but to leave the weapon, and the guy claimed that he didn't have one. This continued for some time, but then the guy actually fired at the officer. I immediately ducked while I listened to shuffling and the cop also radioing something in. I ended up dropping to the floorboard in an effort to shield myself in case this guy started firing. After a while, I started hearing the guy yelling about how his rights were being violated, or something like that, so I looked up and saw that the cop had him pinned to the ground, with 2 other officers nearby. I watched as they shoved him into the back of their car, and after looking through his truck, they then came over to ask me some more questions. They were trying to figure out why he would threaten me the way that he did, and really, their guess was as good as mine. We started with an innocent conversation, but then he quickly became aggressive and demeaning for no reason. My assumption is that between not taking his crap and turning him down, I must have been the one that got to him. I ended up leaving there a lot later than anticipated, but at least I was able to leave with both me and my truck in one piece. While I may not have shown it on the outside, that guy definitely made me feel a bit on edge after hitting me. I knew that he had no intentions of leaving me alone, and I don't know how long it would have continued or escalated, if I wouldn't have stopped. Unfortunately, I know that people like that are everywhere, but I do my best to not let fear dictate my life on the road, or dissuade me from what I love doing. But no matter what, even if you can defend yourself, it's important to never be afraid to seek help if you find yourself in situations like this. So that, my friends, was a collection of some scary stories involving truckers. Some trucker stories. Trucker stories? Truck driver stories? Driver of truck stories? Stories that involve somebody who drives a truck. Anywhere from a big rig to apparently a box truck. Good stories. The box truck one I'm curious about, like, what was the intention of stealing the box truck with auto parts? Like the person mentioned, I know catalytic converters are a hot button thing for people to steal sometimes, but I can't imagine they thought the truck would be just filled with those. So, I don't know. Weird stuff. Poor guy went through a lot with that, and yeah. Anyways, good story. And thank you for sending that story my way, as well as those who sent their story my way, the other stories, and those who allow me to use their stories. You all are great people, and I appreciate you. And thank you. If you listen and got this far, I appreciate you as well. If you enjoyed the video and liked these stories, please consider hitting that thumbs up button, as it does help the channel tremendously. You can also subscribe to the channel if you're new and liked what you heard and want more content like this, or stuff that's different. There's a lot of it, so... you can also leave me a comment down below, letting me know your thoughts, how you're doing, how things are going for you, etc., etc. You can do Join or Patreon, regularly access to content like this, as well as other stuff. You can do a Super Thanks, which is just a donation to the channel. Always appreciated, never ever expected, and all that fun stuff. Yeah. My friends, I do hope you are having a beautiful weekend. I do hope that I see you again very soon. But until that happens, remember you are loved, you are valid. You're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And until I do see you again, much love, and sleep well.